please welcome Mr. Daniel Masson. He's a senior research associate in the Department of Global Development with Cornell University, who will give a high-level summary of key climate trends, challenges, and opportunities. Thank you, Mr. Masson, and welcome.
To go forward as well? That one? Okay. Bueno, muchas gracias por la invitación para poder presentar a todos ustedes. La presentación lo voy a hacer en inglés, pero sí quería decir, agradecer la invitación y la oportunidad de poder hablar un poco de los obstáculos que van a presentar el cambio climático a los sistemas alimentarios y también con la oportunidad de aprender más acerca de la industria cafetera, porque no soy un experto del café, trabajo principalmente en temas de sistemas alimentarios y cómo tener dietas sanas de sistemas sostenibles. Entonces, el café es parte del sistema alimentario, pero no es el enfoque de mi trabajo, entonces estoy bien con la oportunidad de aprender más de ustedes también durante estos días. All right, well, to start off, maybe it's worth giving a little bit of context of where we are and how we've gotten here, and it's worth thinking about that. We've started to enter what scientists are now increasingly call the Anthropocene, and it's an era where we can start to see that in all sorts of different Earth systems, geological systems, we can see the influence of human activities in a way that previously we could only see over sort of long time zones of like geological work. So we can start to see across a whole range of different environmental dimensions the impact that human societies are starting to have. And these couple of figures here, and sorry, as an academic, you're probably going to see some graphs that are a little bit hard to read, but just to give a sense of what all of these are telling us is that basically since the turn of the Industrial Revolution, and especially into the 20th century, we've been seeing massive increases in human population and massive increases in resource use across the board. So this figure shows that we start seeing increases in population, large increases in urbanization, but also in terms of large increases in terms of water use, land use, fertilizer use, and one that's particularly relevant in terms of climate change is then fossil fuel use in the forms of different types of fossil fuels for energy and transportation. But one thing that's also worth noting that as a part of this is that technology has played a really big role also in terms of helping reduce some of the potential consequences of these different growth. If we didn't have massive increases in technology, what we start seeing in terms of resource use would be even worse. And so while it's important to recognize that the technologies that we've developed haven't allowed us to completely bend down the curves, we're still using more resources, it is important to recognize that through these different types of improvements that we are making progress and that there are opportunities to help reduce resource use through improved technology, through better practices. And so while this is a huge challenge, there are opportunities that are presented in this. And as one of the things that we have to be careful about is not sort of falling into despair, which can easily happen when we start seeing sort of the size of the challenges that we're looking at. Some of the trends that we see shaping food systems. So population is still looking like it's going to continue to grow into the 21st century, but it's growing at a slowing rate. And so what we saw from 1960 to today was more than a doubling of the population globally. We're not likely to see that kind of an increase moving forward. And depending on which projection you're looking at, we're looking at population increases peaking most likely some point in this century. Where the population is growing, though, is also something that's worth considering. And so if we start thinking about where the population is growing and where it's starting to already be flat, so we know, we can see from different types of newspaper articles about the worries of, oh, we aren't going to have enough population. What happens with the declining population? We need to increase fertility rates. We see these types of articles happening in Europe and North America. And what we see is on projections that in most high-income countries and regions, population is not projected to grow. In fact, they might even decline. and that future global growth is mostly going to be happening in the global south, sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, where the majority of future population growth is likely to happen. Why is this important? Well, if we start thinking about what are the regions that are most vulnerable to climate change, it's the same regions where we see the largest population growth. So it's one of those things that presents itself as one of these potential tensions and challenges, and climate change is a force multiplier. So problems that we have today are only going to be harder to solve with climate change. The other figure that we have here is, which is a little hard to read, but it just highlights the increasing complexity of food systems. And so a lot of times we think of food systems and we think of the agriculture, the growers, the farmers who are doing that, and they are a critical aspect of the food system. But increasingly, the share of income, the share of value added from the food system that's coming from primary production is declining. And it's increasingly becoming off-farm activities that are becoming more and more a part of the value addition. So what this tells us is that the food systems of the future are going to be increasingly complex. They're going to have additional value added. You know, the previous presentation just highlighted all of the different complexities of brands and things like that that we're going to be looking at. And what we expect is that that type of complexity and increasing off-farm value addition is going to be a key aspect of food systems into the future. So one of the things to think about already is that we often talk about climate change as the future, but climate change is already happening. It's real. We're feeling the consequences of it today. And so if we think about just what we have in terms of the rainfall patterns that were highlighted earlier for Costa Rica, this is one of the types of outcomes that we're expecting to see more of into the future with climate change, is that there's going to be increasing volatility of weather. There's going to be a lot more events, extreme events. And what we can see is that these impacts, we're already starting to feel them. North America right now is in a continent-wide drought, whereas here we're getting massive amounts of rainfall. And so the consequences are already happening as we speak. Today, we're currently contributing about 40 gigatons of CO2 equivalent emissions every year. The food system isn't the primary source of emissions. That comes primarily from energy generation, but it's a major contributor. So even if we got to net zero in the energy sector, if the agriculture and food systems doesn't do anything, we will still not be able to achieve emissions reductions that would be needed to get to a 1.5 or a 2-degree world. So what that just says is that agriculture, while not being the primary source of emissions, is an important source and will have to do part of its job if we're going to try to mitigate climate change. Climate change is, in many ways, I think, a really complex thing. A lot of the stuff that we see are often, I think, focused on very small parts of the impacts that climate change might have on food systems, but it's actually likely to impact across all sorts of supply chains and value chains in different ways and create more volatility, more unpredictability, and present unique challenges to different types of value chains based on their sort of vulnerabilities to these different shocks. So obviously they'll have consequences to agricultural production. Changes in temperature and precipitation can affect what we can grow, how well it grows, but it also will disrupt patterns in terms of pests and diseases, and it will have a human impact. Increasing temperature poses risk to people who are working outside. Already, temperature is one of the biggest causes of human mortality, so having more high temperature days will be a risk for those who have to work outside. This will also have disruptions into distribution and energy networks. So we can see that what happens when you have high temperatures, as we did in California a few years ago, that can lead then to networks breaking down. It can lead to forest fires. We can also have then issues in terms of infrastructure that becomes less reliant. Roads will deteriorate faster, as will bridges. Ports will be challenged by this. And so a range of different types of issues across sort of all of the supply chains, not just in the primary production of crops, even though that will obviously also be a major issue. And as the introduction said, the regions that are looking to be most vulnerable to climate change are overlapped substantially with where coffee is produced. And the types of changes that we're expecting from climate change are likely to make things that are already a problem today even worse. And so for this is just a map that shows areas that have high water scarcity today. And what we can already say, that looking across a range of different climate modeling, is that regions that are already dry today are likely to get drier. And regions that are wet are likely to get wetter. So if regions that are already prone to flooding, this is going to be even more likely to happen in the future. And regions that are already prone to droughts, this is more likely to happen in the future. Temperature increases are expected to happen all over, but we also start to see, when we start looking across a range of different models, that we will likely to see faster increases in temperature as we start heading to higher latitudes, so towards the poles, and in areas in terms of altitude. That one in particular, I think, would be of relevance to coffee growing, as so much of it's done at higher elevations. And so if you start thinking about, we talk about the average global temperature increase, well, that's an important signal, but for agricultural production, the average isn't very helpful because there's a lot of diverse changes. But the fact that areas that are growing under altitude might start seeing the temperature increases more than other areas is a potential challenge and something that needs to be considered. All of this stuff is complicating progress that we've already achieved. And so even though we've doubled the population since 1960, we've dramatically reduced the risk of hunger around the world. More recently, those trends have gone kind of in reverse as we start seeing a range of different events that have made things more problematic. COVID, a range of different droughts across Africa, and civil conflict in Africa, Ukraine, et cetera. All of these things have sort of already started to put us a bit in reverse. We've essentially lost a decade of progress on reducing hunger. But climate change then will mean that all of these other sort of social goals that we have are going to be even harder to achieve into the future. One of the things I think that's worth thinking about is that climate change not only is going to change what happens and where it's happening today, but is likely going to be then a force to sort of shift things and make things move around. So we've already seen evidence that climate change may be contributing to human conflict, and that this may be part of pushing towards human migrations, which can create its own sort of destabilizing effects for both internal and international politics. But it is not only going to be a human phenomenon. We already see that because of changing temperatures, because of changing humidity and precipitation, that pests and diseases themselves are also starting to migrate. And what we start to see is that diseases that were once in a much tighter bound around sort of tropical areas are starting to move towards the poles, north and south. And changes in weather patterns can also disrupt natural cycles in terms of how pests and diseases and the biological controls that keep them in check might start to be influenced so that they are no longer synchronized, creating new problems. This also has then potential knock-on effects in terms of pollinators and what this may mean in terms of their own populations. We can see that there are already issues and concerns with honeybee populations in a lot of countries. But if we start thinking about what are some of the knock-on effects of these types of changes, if we start seeing new pests and diseases in areas that they weren't there, or the biological controls that once used to keep them mostly in check start to fail, we may start to need to use more pesticides and insecticides to keep them in check. That can then have additional knock-on effects that could have negative consequences for pollinator populations that could then have negative effects on agricultural productivity. And so as we see, all these pieces are interconnected, and as one domino falls, it can start to have consequences across a whole range of different outcomes. One of the biggest concerns, I think, for agriculture, and I suspect would be also for coffee, is that climate change is likely to just increase volatility and unpredictability across all of the system. Not only is this going to mean in terms of the prevalence of more droughts and extreme rainfall events, which has huge implications for human well-being. Flooding and rainfall events are already currently the largest source of human mortality from natural disasters. But these are also then likely going to be having a whole bunch of issues in terms of extreme temperature events as well. Not only high temperature events, but also because this starts creating its own kind of feedbacks, the possibility of unpredictable cold snaps as well, all of which can then have negative consequences on the agricultural productivity. This will also have major effects on energy and transportation networks. So regions that have traditionally gotten a lot of their energy from hydroelectricity are going to be challenged because of this. If we start thinking about the distribution networks for energy, will also have additional challenges due to changes in temperature and unpredictable weather patterns. But our distribution and transportation networks are going to also be quite affected. We already see this happening in the last couple of years. Droughts in Panama has led the Panama Canal to operate well below its capacity. There's been concerns in terms of being able to navigate rivers that are key for transporting agricultural products in North America and Europe, in terms of what river levels for the Mississippi or the St. Lawrence Canal, likewise with the Rhine River in Europe. And so what does this mean? All of these things just are going to increase more volatility in terms of distribution. It'll make it more difficult to align supply chains. It also just means that there's likely going to have to be a lot more costs included into this. More planning, more logistics. Potentially there's going to have to be more in terms of storage and inventory to be able to manage what was likely going to be a lot more volatility in our supply chains. What we see is that the regions that are most likely to be impacted by climate change really overlap with the coffee producing belt. And so this makes it a particularly problematic for coffee production. The issues with it being that coffee has a very small area that is suitable for growing. And all of these changes are likely going to make it harder to do that. There may be some areas that might become new areas where you could start to produce coffee that in the past was not feasible, but the likelihood that that is going to be able to compensate the negative consequences on current growing areas is basically, it's not going to make up for the negative consequences that we see in the areas that are currently the major producing areas of coffee. So again, this I kind of already touched on, but essentially one of the big issues I think that we're going to see with agriculture, and I think could be potentially quite problematic for coffee, is the consequences that these changes in weather patterns will have on pests and diseases. We already see that there's increased prevalence of coffee rust that's happening because of changes in humidity and temperature, and what this likely means is that we're going to have to develop new techniques, new management practices, perhaps new technologies, new herbicides and insecticides and pesticides to allow us to control some of these changes. So coffee is one of the world's most traded commodities. I think it's just after oil. And so all of these impacts that we see in terms of the consequences on supply chains are going to have substantial impacts in terms of how reliable coffee supply chains can be. And it will require substantial investments in additional logistics. We expect that there's going to be declining productivity and higher costs due to climate change, not only on the crop side, but kind of across the whole board. We know that the effects of climate change are large enough that we really do need to start doing something about it. And so mitigation is going to be one of the key struggles, I think, for the next couple of decades if we want to try to keep the worst impacts of climate change intact. But while climate mitigation efforts would have long-term benefits in terms of reducing the risks of climate change, in the short term, they also will likely present new challenges for agricultural and food system productions. And so this could be in the form of carbon pricing increasing the cost of energy. It could also be in terms of new mandates, in terms of requirements for more sustainable practices. And so it's one of these things where I believe the coffee industry is already starting to move towards some of these types of practices, a focus in trying to have different brands that focus on more sustainability. So this also presents some opportunities for production, but it certainly is one of those things that could increase challenges for different actors in this space. Climate change is a wicked problem, and by wicked problem, it's just basically that there's so many different pieces that are interconnected to causing these outcomes that trying to solve it essentially is impossible with single solutions. There are no silver bullets to be able to resolve climate change. Adaptation and mitigation are parts of complex systems, and to be able to do any actions in this space, it's likely going to lead to unintended consequences. There will be winners and losers in this. And while there are a lot of opportunities and there's a lot of different practices that can help to reduce the environmental impact of food systems, this could be from promoting healthier diets, which have benefits not only to human health, but also then reduce the resource intensity of the diets that we consume that can then have positive benefits to the environment. It can be looking at ways of trying to increase productivity to reduce resource use. It can also be looking at different types of ecological intensification practices like agroforestry and other nature positive solutions. But all of these types of things often will come with some sort of a trade-off. And so one of the things that we really need to do as we start working through this process of both adapting to and trying to mitigate the worst consequences of climate change is that we need to start having ways and processes that are more participatory, more engaging with a wider range of voices and perspectives so that we can identify who are likely winners and losers of changes across the system so that we can try to find more inclusive and just solutions in the food system. And so essentially what I'm going to leave with is some of the work that we've been doing in terms of questions and trying approaches to think about how to do more in the area of sort of responsible transformation and innovation. And it's a framework that we've started to think about in terms of ways of how do we promote changes across the food system that are more likely to be beneficial to as many people as possible. And essentially what this framework has us think about is it's important that we need any change in the food system to have three key components. And one is that we need to sort of have a process of engaging with a wide range of people so that we can start to establish a permission. And that meaning that changes need to be owned by a wide range of people. It can't just be sort of one person's idea of what the future needs to be. It needs to be a shared vision, and that the changes that we want to do are more mutually shared. And then after that, we then need to do real efforts to sort of think about, okay, well now once we have sort of this agreed upon vision, what are the types of actions that we want? How do we then create an enabling environment that facilitates those types of changes? Thinking about policies, institutions that are needed to sort of reinforce and support actions towards these changes. And then finally thinking about the reality that in any complex system, any changes that we make ultimately will have unintended consequences. So we need to invest more on monitoring so that we can see when there are changes or problems occur, that we can then actually try to do something about them and correct them. It's impossible to do any kind of transition that's going to be perfect. There will always be mistakes. We don't have perfect information. And so we need to have an ability to both gather data on when things change in a direction we don't want, and then try to do course corrections and adapt to that accordingly. And so, yeah, essentially these are kind of the things we were working on. And I think climate change itself is a deeply challenging issue and is likely to present many problems across the board. And I think the coffee industry itself, like most of the other industries, is going to have to find ways to sort of adapt to this, because as much as I wish to say that we are going to get to a 1.5 world and meet the Paris Agreement, on current trends that seems unlikely. And so it seems much more likely that we're going to be going past 1.5 in this century. And so while we need to continue to have efforts towards pushing towards mitigation to try to reduce the most negative consequences, the worst increases in temperature, the reality is climate change is going to continue to happen, so we need to focus a lot of attention as well on adaptation. And yeah. So again, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to get to speak with you, and I hope to get to engage with you in the next couple days and learn a whole lot more about coffee and the coffee industry.